Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Fatima Insha, and I'm a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. It is my privilege to extend a warm welcome to all to today's ICS Wednesday seminar titled China's Local Government Can They Pull the Weight of the Country's Economy? China's economy has been undergoing a structural slowdown after experiencing 4 decades of near double digit growth rates. For the third time in a row, China has set an annual growth target of around 5% for 2025. For the third time, the extent to which this target will be met depends largely on the performance of local governments, which account for nearly 88% of national expenditure. However, their fiscal situation continues to worsen. Not only has the general budgetary revenue as a percentage of GDP dropped, but revenue from sale of land use rights has also sharply declined. Local government debt, including hidden debt, has soared to over 50% of GDP. With the central leadership's crackdown on illegal debt, coupled with falling revenues, the fiscal space for the local governments has been drastically reduced. At the same time, their expenditure responsibilities have continued to grow, resulting in the structural fiscal imbalance. This imbalance has, in turn, severely constrained the ability of local governments to effectively support economic growth. The speaker for today's seminar is Mr. Amit Kumar, who is a staff research analyst at the China desk of the Indo-Pacific Studies program at the Takshashila Institute. With a broader focus on China, he studies issues at the intersection of economy, technology, and security. He writes on a wide range of issues, including China's economy, domestic politics, foreign policy, and India China trade and security relations. The chair for today's seminar is Professor Biswajit Dhar, who is a distinguished professor at the Council for Social Development in New Delhi. He is an honorary fellow at the ICS. He formerly taught at Jawaharlal Nehru University. He was also the Director General of the Research and Information System for Developing Countries. He has represented India in major multilateral negotiations and has served on expert groups for various international organizations. He is widely published in national and international journals. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to ask all participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants shall be muted during the seminar. Questions may be posted in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option during the interactive session. You shall then be called upon to unmute yourself. Thank you. I now hand over to the chair. Over to you, Professor Dhar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatima. I must apologize for this the very bad throat that I am having. So you could have, I think, many of you would have heard me coughing. It's a real pleasure once again to be with you all, facilitating this presentation by Amit, which is an extremely interesting topic. As as all of you know that the local governments in China, they did a lot of heavy lifting during the process of rapid expansion of the Chinese economy, the decades in which it expanded rapidly, and a lot of infrastructure projects, and which were very critical to the development that we saw in China, was actually the expenses were actually picked up by the local government. The local government was, of course, doing very well because of the real estate boom, and a lot of its finances were land related, and so the real estate boom really benefited the local governments quite handsomely. Now, the entire situation actually turned around after the pandemic, where the Chinese economy was severely affected, and what we are now really concerned about is the way the local governments have been hit by this crisis. Now, one indicator is the extent to which local government debt is going up, and I'm sure Amit is going to talk about it. And if you look at China's overall debt to GDP ratio, and these are IMF numbers, in 2023, this was overall public debt was put at around 69% of the GDP. Now that's very reasonable, because if you look at the largest economy, the US. US has a public debt to GDP ratio of over 120% and 21, 22%. So as compared to US and even India, India has debt to GDP, public debt to GDP ratio, which is almost 90%. So Chinese, these official numbers look extremely good by global standards. But when you start looking at the off-balance sheet liabilities that the local governments have have at this point, and these liabilities have resulted from the debts issued by these entities called the local government financing vehicles. Once you start looking at these numbers, the situation seems to be completely reversed. And again, according to the IMF, the local government financing vehicle debt in 2023 was almost 48% of the GDP, and this increased from about 13% in 2014. So within a period of 10 years or less, there's been a sharp increase. So if you look at the real, debt to GDP ratio that China faces, it's actually close to 117%. So it's quite close to what the US faces. So this really sounds alarm bells, because at this rate and the rate at which local government debt is actually expanding, the capacity of the local governments is actually seriously constrained. And the contribution that they made in the past, that of course will be seriously affected now. They'll be impaired seriously, and their contribution in the sort of rebuilding efforts at this point, which China seems to be trying, would really be quite constrained. So where do we go from here, and what does the future look like for these for the local government and their capacity to pull the economy through this kind of a relative slowdown? I would use the word relative, because China is still growing at about 5%. Because these are official numbers, and where does China go from here? So let me now welcome Amit. You have the floor, and please take your time, and welcome once again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Dhar and ICS. I would like to extend my gratitude first for this wonderful opportunity to share my paper. I'll just share my screen. Let me know if my slides are visible.
Yeah. You can see a graph. Yeah. Are you starting from a graph?
Yeah.
Do you have a PowerPoint presentation, Amit?
Yes.
Okay.
Is it visible now?
Yeah, it is visible, but is this the first slide?
Yeah, this is the first slide.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so the title of my presentation, again, as has already been introduced by Professor Dhar, is China's local governments, can they pull the weight of the country's economy? Before we dive straight into the research that I came across during the course of this paper, would like to put some key judgments up front, and we can come back to that during the course of the presentation. So first key point that I would like to highlight is that there's been a consistent decline in the revenues of the local governments over the years. And you would see that in the two foremost two most primary budgets that Chinese local governments maintain. We'll come to that. China's accounting practices obscures the extent of local government's financial rules, and there's quite extraordinary in the way that the Chinese maintain their accounts, and that to some extent, to quite an extent, actually obscures the condition of fiscal situation of the local governments there. The crackdown of budget financing, it has further compounded the local government's problem. We'll see how it started after 2014. And lastly, measures that have been introduced so far to address the issue, whether be it front door policy or the $10 trillion Chinese yuan debt relief package that was announced last November, they have failed to solve crisis. With that, let's come on to China's local governments and why they're very important in the context of the country's economy. So, unlike any other country in the world, I would say China's local governments are quite special in the sense that they carry out about 85% of the national general budgetary expenditure. So the national general of which only 15% is carried out by the central government, and a bulk of it close to 85% is what is the share of the local governments in China. And the local governments, when I talk of local governments, these include all levels of government with below the central government. So that includes provincial and sub-provincial governments. In aggregate terms, if you look at the numbers, the total national general budgetary expenditure is somewhere around 28.4 trillion Chinese yuan, and of which 24.4 trillion Chinese yuan is what is carried out by local governments. And if you have you want to compare it with any other country, Brazil is a good example, as it is perhaps the world's most touted as the most fiscally federal country, and there the provincial, some provincial uh, governments make up for about 50% of the national budgetary expenditure. So, by that, in that context, if you see, China's local governments do the heavy lifting. And this graph presents the split between between the central and the local governments when it comes to expenditure and revenue. Of course, when you look at the revenue pool here, uh, and you can if you can see my cursor here, 10.03 trillion of trillion Chinese yuan is further transferred to the local governments from the central pool revenue pool. So this leaves very small amount with the central government, and that's how you see that local governments carry out major chunk of the expenditure. In percentage terms, again, if you look at expenditure, it's somewhere around 85% for the local governments, and revenue is somewhat equally shared between the two levels of the government. But again, this figure here does not take into account the central transfers that are made by the central to the local governments. That then again brings the revenue share of the central government below. But these central transfers are tied. They are not general transfers; they are tied transfers. Now, if you look at this, does not what we I have just discussed does not tell you the whole story of local government's finances. If you look at local government's financial accounts, unlike anywhere in the world, again, they have four separate budgets. We have accounts within budgets mostly, but they have accounts and they have then four budgets, of which general budget is only one of the budgets, right? And here you see the revenue, the corresponding revenue and expenditure that have been highlighted here. So they have budgets: general budget, government managed fund budget, social insurance fund budget, and state capital operations budget. We have to largely concern ourselves with these two budgets, the first two, general budget and government managed fund budget. Social insurance fund budget is largely an isolated fund or isolated budget. Entire expenses and revenue is meant for insurance purposes. And state capital operations budget, if you look at the numbers here, they're very small to make any difference. So largely what we're dealing here with when we look at local governments, we're largely dealing with the general budget and government managed fund budget. And these
Uh,
are the,
Mr. Amit,
yeah,
can you, your slides are not moving. You
yeah,
are at slide 8 out of 27.
slide 6.
Yeah,
No,
yeah,
it's
it's not.
slide
Yeah,
8.
yeah, it's
they are not moving. So maybe you could try resharing them.
Oh,
It's the 7th.
Yeah, now it
Now
is.
it's 6th. Yeah,
okay.
it's 6th now. Thank you.
I'm so sorry. Should I go back? Do you want me to go back?
It's all right, but please ensure that they move when you.
Yeah. Okay. I'll just do a recap, quick recap, if that's not a problem. So, if you look at the general local governments here, they make up for about 85% of the total budget, total expenditure. In aggregate terms, they're about the general budgetary expenditure is somewhere around 28.4 trillion, of which only 20, of which 24.4 trillion Chinese yuan is spent by the local governments. And if you have if you want to do a comparison, Brazil, which is touted as the most fiscally federal country, roughly 50% of the national budgetary expenditures carried out by provincial and sub-provincial governments. So that gives you a glimpse of what the Chinese local governments do, right? This provides you here with the split between the central and the local governments in China. You look at the expenditure, they make up for maximum more than 85% of the expenditure. Revenue, when you look at here, you will find that while the central pool, they equally share the national pool, 10.03 trillion of Chinese yuan was made as a transfer payments to the local governments by the central government, and therefore this is how they're able to the local governments manage to uh, make the expenditures. In percentage terms, this is the split. Again, this does not take into account the central transfers that are made later from the central government to the local government. And yeah, and these are the four. If you look at the financial accounts, the Chinese financial accounts, you have four budgets that they maintain, unlike anywhere in the world. And we largely have to concern ourselves with the first two. They are called the primary, two primary budgets of the Chinese local governments. That's the general budget that we just talked about, I referred to. There's another one called government managed fund budget. Third one is called social insurance fund budget, and lastly, it's state capital operations budget. Now, we largely have to concern ourselves with the first two budgets. The social insurance fund budget is an isolated budget. The entire revenue and expenditure in this budget caters to the insurance purposes, five insurances that the Chinese have, the Chinese the country China has. And then you have state capital operations budget, where revenue is earned through profit and sales from state-owned enterprises. But this is a very small budget, and if you look at the numbers here, hardly 0.5 trillion Chinese yuan. Otherwise, if you see the first two primary budgets, they are the main stay of China's local government's budget. Now, the problem the Chinese local governments are facing is mounting fiscal pressure. Uh, and here I would like to highlight two types of crisis that the local governments are facing. One is the budget crisis, where you see falling income from general budget, and you also see falling income from real estate crisis. Because of the real estate crisis, you see foreign income from land sales, right? And then you have off-budget crisis. I'll come to that later at the later stage of the presentation, where you have seen over the years consistent piling of LGFV's debt, and the government has then tried to crack down on this illegal debt and hidden debt, which has now come to bite back the fiscal situation. It has worsened because of I mean, it was necessary, but then it has created its own challenges in due course. Now, this represents the local income from general budget revenue, the first primary budget that I talked about. And if you see, you might not be able to make out that this, I mean, one of the problems with this graph is that over the years, the growth in local income has not been consistent. You might not make it out, make that difference when you see the bar graph, but when you compare it when you see it as a percentage of GDP, you see that after 2015, it has constantly declined. and the local general budget revenue as a percent of GDP. If you figure it, if you calculate it as a percent of GDP, it has constantly declined and is somewhere around 17.5% now. It used to be somewhere around 20% in between 2014, 2016, but that has now constantly declined. And this is one of the reasons why you see that the local governments is experiencing fiscal constraints. Now, these two graphs represent the property-related taxes that the local governments have as percentage of their tax revenues. So, if you look at tax revenues, property-related taxes make up. There are five types of property taxes, which is you see five lines, five in the on the left chart. You see that, and there are five types of taxes, except for the house property tax. You see that there has been a consistent, almost somewhat of a decline in other property-related taxes. And what this has meant actually is that property-related taxes, the five taxes, when you combine it as a percentage of tax revenue, again after 2020, you start to see a decline, and they're going downwards. And because they make up for about 20 to 25% of tax revenues, this fall is very significant, and it makes a dent on the revenue share of the local governments. Local government manage fund budget, right? The second primary budget that I talked about, in addition to the general budget. So here also, if you see this represents over the years, this represents the revenue of local government managed fund budget. And you see that 2020 was the peak where the sales from the revenue from land sales, I think, peaked in 2020, and sorry, in 2021, in fact, where you had about 8.7 trillion of Chinese yuan as revenue from land sales, and this constituted as the single biggest source of revenue for the local governments, right? But in the following years, you see that there's been a constant decline again when you look at the figures from revenue from land sales. And this has happened after the crackdown, the government crackdown on the real estate, and the real estate property bubble burst. You see that has been a constant decline. And now you see that the years of very high revenue growth and large sums of revenue that it used to earn through this fund has also shrunk. But the puzzle that begins to, one begins to question when one looks at the fiscal, the balance sheet, is that if you account for what we have seen so far in the previous slides, is the local government fiscal deficit for 2024 comes around to about 1.8% of GDP, because the three budgets or the four budgets, the three latter budgets that we discussed, largely maintain a budget surplus. That is the fund budget, social insurance, and state-owned capital enterprises. Only the primary budget of general budget has some budget deficit. And if you combine that, make calculations, you'll find out that about the local government deficit, fiscal deficit, is only about 1.8% of GDP. And if you account for other three budgets, and because they have a surplus account, this further reduces. So the question remains, why isn't the crisis showing up in the accounts? And when you investigate, you find that there's some problem with China's accounting practice. So between 2020 to 2023, the local governments in China raised about 3.8 trillion on average Chinese yuan each year through special purpose bond. Now, special purpose bonds, if you see this graph, is uh, the second largest source of revenue for the local governments. You could see the numbers here from 3.8 starting from 2020 to about 3.9 2024. So this is what they have been raising as special debt revenue, right? But if you look deeper, you would find that this is actually this one source, which constitutes the second largest source of revenue for the local government's managed fund budget, is technically a debt masquerading as revenue, which the Chinese government does not take into account when uh, calculating fiscal deficit. This is actually the government actually issues special purpose bonds, and the money raised through this is categorized as special debt revenue. And when you take that into account, you find that and you also have to discount other factors, which I'll not go into detail, but what you see in the local general budget, you'll find that a lot of transfers are usually made, which if I can just go back to the slide here. Yeah, these at the top that you find the some transferred funds and carryover balances, you have to discount those because these are largely funds that are transferred from budget stabilization fund, which is not actually a revenue, but the government has to dig into that uh, pool to make up for the budget deficit. Then there are inter-budget deficits that again you have to discount for to avoid double counting. And then if you also discount special debt revenue, this is the figure that you come up with. And if you combine the central government's fiscal deficit, you find that the consolidated national fiscal deficit breaches the 6.5 mark, which is well above the 3% national target that was announced last year. For this year, the government has outlined a target of 4%, but it is expected that if the trends continue, it will breach the 8% mark this year as well. So despite the 3% national target, if you make the calculations and take these into account, you find that the China's consolidated fiscal deficit as a percent of GDP is somewhere around 6.5%. Now, the problem does not stop here. The budgetary figures that we just looked at does not capture the true extent of local government's fiscal views, right? Fiscal goals. The problem is because of their reliance on off-budget financing, which they go back to meet their expenditure mandates. The problem arises, and the why is this? I mean, one would ask that why this problem arose in the first place, and why this heavy reliance on off-budget financing. And the answer to that would be two legislations that China came up with in 1994: tax sharing system and the budget law of 1994. Now, what they did was the tax sharing system was introduced by the central government in 1994, and the idea was they had been witnessing a decline in central government's share of national revenue. So what they did was that they reject the numbers, and uh, what happened was after the new tax sharing system came into existence, uh, a large chunk of, 40% of is collecting the revenue tax proceeds. 53% of the tax proceeds started going to the central pool, while 47% of the tax was collected in local pool. And this was a drastic decline from what the local governments used to get before this tax sharing system. If you want to compare the numbers, the share of general budgetary revenues dropped from 78% of the national pool in 1993. This is the local governments that I'm talking about, to 54% after the introduction of the taxing system. And at the same time, the expenditure mandate rose from 70% to 85%, as we saw at the beginning of the slides. And the problem did not stop here. There were another set of restrictions that were imposed on the local governments. They could not impose new taxes. This authority was solely with the central government. And then they could also not raise tax rates. They could not decide new taxes, but also not raise the tax rates on already existing taxes beyond a certain range that was again set by the central leadership. So there were very severe constraints as far as tax was concerned for the local governments. Now, the second culprit was budget law of 1994. Again, what this law did was that it prevented the local governments from directly raising money from the banks or the market, and it blocked off a major borrowing source for them. This is something which is not does not happen everywhere in the world, but this is what the law was in China. This was, of course, amended later in 2014. But what happened as a result of this was that local governments because they could not borrow directly from the market, they found a way in setting up local government financing vehicles, which could then borrow from the market, issue bonds, and then borrow from the market. And over the years, they become very critical to the financing of local governments. And from 1994, you saw a meteoric rise in the number of LGFVs. And then later in 2008, when the global financial crisis struck, the central leadership was under pressure to expand, to make a fiscal expansion. And therefore, at that point of time, the central government itself encouraged the local governments to use LGFVs to step up their investments. And as a result, what happened was that you had, and because these were off the budget, because uh, the local governments could not borrow directly from the market, they had to find a way through LGFVs. Over time, what happened, because of the proliferation of LGFVs, that they had accumulated massive debt. And it started to come out in news reports, and concerns were being raised. As a result, the government in 2013 did an audit, and it disclosed that there was some the hidden debt was somewhere around 17.9 trillion Chinese yuan, and which then forced government into action. In 2014, they came out with this new policy, which was named opening the front door while closing the back door. Under this policy, what they did was they amended the budget law, again, which restricted them from directly raising money from the market. What they did was the amendment allowed the local governments to now issue special purpose bonds. Again, the same bonds through which they raise special debt revenue that we talked about a few minutes ago. And what this did was, they could also under this policy, what they could also do is they could swap hidden debt with local governments bond. So what this would essentially mean is that on paper the Chinese local governments could issue bonds, but they would as an accounting size, they would replace that bonds with hidden debt that were off budget before. And this was done to bring hidden debt into official records. So no new debt were being given out, were being taken, but it was largely a replacement of debt which was happening on the books. Then the central leadership also said that a distinction has to be made between government debt and enterprise debt. And no LGFV debt could be added as government debt. So before this, all the LGFV debt was implicitly guaranteed by government guarantees, and largely with land as collateral, and even future land sales as collateral, right? So that was a thing, and which was leading to this bubble. But the government said that no LGFV debt can be now added as government debt, and it barred the local governments from giving guarantees to any of the LGV debt. And all new debts which were incurred by LGFVs since 2015 were categorized as enterprise debt. So the existing debt, they were asked to make a distinction between government debt and enterprise debt, and most of the debt were categorized as enterprise debt, and the new debts were to be counted as enterprise debt. And in the meantime, LGFVs had to find a new financing model that did not rely on land-based financing. So these were some of the uh, steps that the central government took to crack down on this illegal debt. What they call it as illegal debt. But the problem persisted, right? And this crackdown, although was very, I think it's a good policy decision on the central government's part, but it failed to solve the crisis, mostly because by that time the debt had piled up, and it took time for the decision to make its way through the lower rounds, right? And according to official estimates, at the end of 2024, China's local government total outstanding debt is somewhere around 47 trillion Chinese yuan, but this does not take into account the hidden debts. But the Chinese official figures, in the last working government work report and execution of budget report, they have pointed out that the hidden debt at this point of time in the Chinese economy, the local government's hidden debt is somewhere around 14.3 trillion Chinese yuan. But if you look at the independent assessments that have been done on the local governments and which includes LGFV debt, that alone range in somewhere between 50 to 100 trillion Chinese yuan in 2023. The IMF figure puts it somewhere around 60 to 70 trillion Chinese yuan, right? So the problem has persisted. They have not been able to clean up the debt, the hidden debt, especially that is plaguing the local governments. Now, the government last year did, and it came, garnered a lot of traction, was that it came out with a $10 trillion Chinese yuan debt relief package. It happened last November, and but the problem was that this did very little to elevate the situation. Again, if you compare the scale of the debt and the package, it is nowhere near. But also the details of the plan. So to begin with, this was not a bailout plan, so not something which would remove hidden or official debt from the balance sheets. But what it actually was designed to do was that it had two parts. The first component of the package was to was to allow the local governments to replace up to 6 trillion Chinese yuan of their hidden debt with government bonds over 3 years. So again, you would not what they would necessarily do is, for this particular quota up to 6 trillion Chinese yuan, the local governments will be allowed to bring back those hidden debt into official records over a period of 3 years, and the remaining 4 trillion Chinese yuan would be dedicated towards would be provided as additional special purpose bonds quota. So every year, what the central government does is that they assign a quota that we discussed in the second primary budget, the special debt revenue that the local governments raise. Now, they do not have the independence to go to the market and raise as much as they want. There's a set quota that is provided by the central government, and what the central government under this debt relief package has essentially said is that will allow you additional special purpose bonds quota over a period of 5 years. So that again, 4 trillion Chinese yuan is divided over 5 years, and that comes somewhere around 800 billion Chinese yuan every year. So an additional quota of 800 billion Chinese yuan would be given to the local governments to raise debt. So, and the argument, the central argument that the government is presenting here is that this would, because some of the hidden debt would come back to official records, and it will have a government backing. Essentially what it would do is it would save 600 billion Chinese yuan in interest payments, and this is how they would correct the hidden debt problem. But the challenge is that the scale of China's local debt, both if you account for the official and hidden, it means that the fiscal space for local governments is fast shrinking, and especially in the light of the crackdown on illegal debt. So earlier, up until 2014, and again, because the implementation was not very clear until 2016 or 2017, the Chinese local governments could still go out and raise money from the market and illegal debt to finance their expenditure. But this heavy crackdown over the years has meant that that space has gone. And while the Chinese local governments can still bank on LGFVs to raise revenue, the condition that the central government has placed is that they have to shift from land-based finance model to a new revenue model where land is not used as collateral, and that is something what the LGFVs have been struggling to do, and therefore this challenge has persisted. The other challenge with the front door policy, again, a good policy, but the problem is that it offers very limited fiscal space for the local governments, because one, again, as you saw, also is very evident in the 10 trillion Chinese yuan debt relief package, that a significant portion of that quota is spent towards debt replacement, and it happens every year. So if 3.8 trillion Chinese yuan is being allotted for special purpose bonds, a portion of that, the local governments have an option of swapping debt or debt replacement, wherein they can bring hidden debt into official records in place of actually issuing special purpose bonds. So a significant portion of that goes towards debt replacement, which leaves very little for the capital expenditure that the local governments were used to in the past. Now, they have also the Chinese government has also come up with plans for tax and fiscal reforms that were first highlighted last year during the third plenum. And they had three central ideas, and one of the ideas was that what they could essentially do to alleviate the problems of the local governments was to increase central transfers. Now, central transfer, this could be a way out, but it doesn't seem plausible because as we saw in the first two slides, already about 93% of the revenue the central government today raises in the general budgetary, in the central government general budget, is already given away as transfers to the local governments. So there's hardly any room for the central government to increase central transfers. It can't go up to 100%. 93, I think, is already an extraordinary number. And therefore, you could only do it you could only do it if the central government raises its share of debt. Again, that will have its own problem, the rising national debt problem, or it increases revenue from some other sources or increases tax. Again, that will have problems for domestic consumption. If China at this point wants to boost domestic consumption, raising taxes would could be counterproductive. One will have to see how it unfolds, but again, that's a call that the Chinese government will have to take. The second was, if you the second one of the options that have been again proposed as part of tax and fiscal reforms is to increase local government's tax receipts. But again, the problem is that they could only do it. The local governments can only do it either by raising current tax rates or finding new taxes, because we have already seen that that local tax as a percentage of revenue is declining. So, and they have not seen a consistent growth over the years. In some years you have had a growth of 0.5 trillion Chinese yuan. In some years they have been as small as 0.1 trillion Chinese yuan. So that's also a problem. And again, if you find new taxes or increase tax rates, again, it will be counterproductive given your domestic consumption, the country's domestic consumption goals. And yeah, this is a problem. The third option that has been suggested is that the central government itself increases its share of national expenditure, because again, which sets up China apart is the central government does not carry out a major part of the national expenditure, and therefore it has been a suggestion which is proposed that the central government could itself, go ahead and increase its share of national expenditure to relieve the pressure on the local governments. But again, given that the former already transfers 93% of the budgetary revenue to the local governments, the problem is that though the 10 trillion Chinese yuan that is transferred to the local government, they come with mandates. So it's not as if the central government is not spending, but largely the execution is being done by the local government. So, and the other problem is that already to account for that, the Chinese central government is transferring about 93% of the budgetary revenue to the local governments. So where is the space for the Chinese central government to raise that debt? And it could only come if it can raise additional debt, again, which will complicate the national consolidated fiscal debt situation, which we already saw was about at 6.5% in 2024, and is expected to cross 8% this year, which is quite extraordinary, not something which is sustainable in long term. So the question really is, where do you find the money from? And this is the problem that the Chinese local governments and the central leadership have been struggling with. That's end of my presentation. I'll be happy to take any questions and clarifications.
Thank you very much, Amit. for this wonderful presentation. Going through these numbers as to where the shoe actually pinches. Now, it pretty much it seems it's pretty clear from your presentation that it's an almost intractable problem that the Chinese economy faces, because there is absolutely no headroom for the central government to do any more transfers, and the local governments don't have the means to expand their expenditure, their revenues. So it's a sort of a catch-22 situation where it will be very difficult to wriggle out. I just wanted before I open the floor for discussions and questions and comments. I just wanted to know from you, what is the share of interest payments in the total expenditure in the central government, and if you have the numbers, because that is a very interesting number, which tells us, gives us some additional information about the debt sustainability. This is something that India had actually was struggling with, and we sort of brought it under control. So if you have the numbers, both for the central and the local governments, that'll be very interesting.
Yeah, unfortunately, I did. I mean, while researching, I did come across the interest payments, the share the share that is between the central and the local governments. But at that point of time, I don't quite recollect as to what that number is. I'll have to.
Because that's very important. Again, like you said, that 93% of the central government is actually transferring 93%. Where there is absolutely no headroom at all.
Yeah.
Now, the interest payments that also tell us this whole story as to whether it's so large, and that's a mandatory payment. You can't actually escape that. So whether how much of headroom does the budget have? The budgetary, the rest of the expenditure have, and how can that be spent to pull the economy by its bootstraps? So let me questions and comments, please. I don't see any in the chat box, so I don't. Please don't tell me that you're so convinced by what Amit said that you just don't have any answer to the question. So there is a question here from Soumya Datta from Jamia Millia. And her question is, given the central role of labor mobility in supporting dynamic and flexible economic growth, how does the continued existence and enforcement of the hukou system constrain the ability of local governments in China to attract and retain skilled labor, respond to demographic shifts, and manage urban development effectively? Furthermore, in what ways does this institutional limitation affect the fiscal sustainability and long-term economic performance of local governments, especially inland or in inland or less developed regions that may already face structural disadvantages? So quite a few questions rolled into one, Amit.
If the question is with respect to hukou system and how that, if I correctly understood, how that constrains the ability of the local governments. So again, hukou reforms have been touted as one of the policy measures to address the consumption problem in China. If you do that, what it would necessarily mean that the local governments will have to provide for social security measures, and therefore it will reduce the pressure on the migrant workers, and that would lead to a boost in consumption. Now, the problem here is that local governments are not quite convinced. And if you look at the reports, there has been a lot of resistance from the local governments with respect to these reforms. Some of it has been implemented, but largely provinces have been against this. The reason is that if it goes through, the reforms goes through, local governments will be responsible for providing the social security means to those migrant workers. At this point of view, they did not have to provide for that social security for the migrant workers. They might come and work in other provinces, but the burden of social security is not with the local governments. But if these reforms go through, it will be a burden on the local governments. And the fact that they're already reeling under pressure, the financial pressure, and there are a lot of pressures, the falling revenues, they have not been able to pay their employees. Then they have self mandates that they put on themselves, that will achieve this. They set a target, provincial target of 5%, 6% growth target. Then they have local champions to support, which constantly rely on subsidies. So there's no fiscal space to have this hoku, to have this reforms pushed through. So the problem is, there's a problem, bit of friction. The hoku, if you if the central government tries to push through these reforms, it would create extra burden on the local governments, because then they'll be pushed to provide the social security means. The second question is, what does this institutional limitation affect fiscal system? No. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I answered the question. If this goes through, if you this institutional limit that is put on by Hooper reforms, it will create extra pressure for the local governments to cater for the already, expenditure that they are not able to make.
Anyone else? Any other question or comment? You just wait for a minute, and I can't even see anyone typing here. Okay, I don't think there's any other question or comment on this very excellent presentation. So finally, as I said, that this seems to be a real millstone around the neck of the Chinese economy, and like as Amit mentioned, that the government is relying on boosting domestic consumption, and of course, with the global economy, becoming even less certain, despite what China is doing in moving away from the US and reliance on the US and moving into other markets. It's pretty clear, and it's been clear for almost a decade and more, that the erstwhile Chinese strategy of depending on international markets as a trigger for its develop for its growth, its fast growth. Now that phase is now passé, and of course, when the financial crisis of 2008 came, a lot of most of the major economies told China that they can't rely on the global markets anymore. They have to boost their domestic consumption to trigger their growth. And I think that situation is now upon them. That China will have to really refocus, and I know as people say that sort of decouple from the global economy quite substantially. Of course, if you look at the trends, if you look at the trade to GDP ratios of China, has been substantially coming down over the past decade. So there are there are efforts being made by the Chinese leadership to depend less on the global markets. But then there have been costs, and we can quite clearly say this. Of course, for a country which is got used to expanding at such a rapid rate, coming down to about 5% is something that is not, sort of becomes unacceptable. But then, as China is sort of moving towards an advanced country and a developed country, a high-income country, it's also logical that it can't actually grow at the rate that it was going 20 years back. So its growth rate also has to come down. And like most other advanced countries, they don't go grow at that even 3%. 3% is something of, of an achievement for them. So I think the Chinese economy will have to be realistic in terms of its how much it can achieve, and once I think these expectations are they become more realistic, I think the Chinese economy will we just hope for the rest of the world that China is able to manage its economy better, and the kind of debt overhang that local governments are facing, and now that is now being felt by the central government as well. This would be solved one way or the other. Of course, Amit couldn't give an answer as to how this debt could be reduced, but one way or the other, they can address this problem, and we hope that in his next presentation, China and Amit is able to give us some concrete evidence as to how China can possibly manage its sort of bulging debt. Because if it continues to grow in that rate, China's the whole sort of sustainability of the growth sustainability is going to be seriously questioned, and that's not, like I said, it's not going to be a good news for the global economy given the large presence of China. So let me thank all of you for being here to to be part of this wonderful presentation that Amit has made, has taken us through a really vexed problem that the second largest economy is facing. And as I said, that we would be looking for some answers from Amit in this forum, and we hope that he'll come back again to us and share his fresh findings at not too distant in future. So let me thank you all once again and hand over to Fatima.
Thank you, Chair. With this, we come to an end of today's seminar. We thank Mr. Amit Kumar and Professor Biswajit Dhar for gracing us today's seminar with their presence and for giving us their precious time. We also offer gratitude to the audience for joining us today. The video of today's discussion shall be available on the ICS YouTube channel. We would like to invite you to the upcoming Wednesday seminar scheduled on 4th June 2025. Further information regarding the event can be found on the ICS website. You may also subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you all for joining us today.